Hi, this is Ms. Wiles, and in this video we'll be solving quadratic equations by completing the square. We're going to start off this video by talking briefly about something that we've talked about before. And if you haven't talked to me about it, maybe you can go find another video somewhere about that. But we talked about completing the square, and completing the square is when you have a quadratic trinomial that starts out with a leading coefficient of 1, and then you have something here as the linear term like 14x. Completing the square is making a perfect square trinomial by adding something here. And the something here that we would need to add is half of 14, which is 7, and then square it, so we'd be adding 49. Even if the 14 was minus, we'd still be taking half of that, which is negative 7, and squaring it, and when we square anything, it's always positive, and we'd be adding 49. So that's just one example. Another, if we had x squared minus 100x, well, let's not use 100. Let's use 20. 20x. What is half of 20?
10.
And what is 10 squared?
100.
100. So you'd be adding 100 to that, and that's called completing the square. Now, we'll be solving equations by completing the square using the steps that were on the other screen. If you're watching this at home, copying down those steps might come later, or whatever it is that you do. You can make your own notes. You don't have to copy down every word, just whatever makes sense to you. So we're going to take this equation, f squared minus 24f equals 19. Now, it is not a perfect squared trinomial, and we know it because half of 24 is 12, and we don't see a plus 144 up here. So we can solve this first by making sure that the left side of the equation looks like x squared plus something x. It does, or minus. I like it when we put a plus or minus. In this particular equation, we don't have to do anything because it already looks like that. The left-hand side of the equation is f squared minus 24f. The right-hand side of the equation doesn't have to be 0. It could be anything, any number. Step 2 is to add that number that makes the perfect square to both sides of the equation. So step 2 is taking the 24 and halving it and then squaring it to get a number. And what will that number be?
144.
That'll be 144. So we're going to add 144 to both sides of the equation. So the second line will look like this. F squared minus 24f plus 144 equals, and we're adding the 144 to the 19, and that will be 163. Step 2 is done. Step 3 is to factor the left side as this x plus b over 2 in parentheses squared. That happens every single time. And it could be a minus though, so I like to include a minus there. And we can tell what that's going to be by looking at this sign. If that's a minus, it's going to be a minus. If that's a plus, it's going to be a plus. The next line will look like this. F minus 12, all of that squared, equals 163. That is the beauty of why this works, because it's going to happen like that every single time. Whatever half of this number is, that's what's going to go inside the parentheses. Step 4 has a lot of steps that come after it that they can't put up there because then you have to solve. It says take the square root and solve. Now you're taking the square root of both sides of the equation, so you end up with f minus 12 because you take the square root of that side, and that equals plus or minus the square root of 163. So you're just taking the square root of both sides. Once you've done that, you might not realize it, but you only have one more step to do. Only one more step to do to solve this, and that is to add 12 to both sides of the equation. Now we're going to have two solutions when we rewrite the last step. F equals 12 plus or minus the square root of 163. Because your instructions do not tell you to give your answer in simplified radical form, it tells you to give your answers in decimals rounded to the nearest hundredth. 12 plus the square root of 163 rounded to the nearest hundredth is 24.77. The other answer is 12 minus the square root of 163, which rounded to the nearest hundredth is negative 0.77. Those two numbers are your two solutions. Notice that this method does not allow you to factor the original equation. This method works to find solutions, not to find factors, but that's okay because you don't have to find factors if you use this method. So there we have one example of this. This one, if you're watching this video at home, I want you to understand this is one that we've done in another class. If you're in my fourth block, we're not going to go over this one in here. I'm going to press that X over there so that you can see the whole way this is worked out. You can include it in your notes if you look at this at another time. And the reason, that's fine, just leave yourself some space to try to work it out yourself, and then you can go back into this video and see if you got it right. Like you would pause right there. But we are moving on. We will do this one. Now this one, I don't have the steps written over to the side. We're going to follow the steps. Here we go. I don't like S's because they look like my 5s, so I'm going to change those S's to X's. All right, so here we go. I'm going to change that S to an X. And at the same time, because I know that on the left-hand side, my first step says that on the left-hand side, this is all I can have. So I'm going to add 31 to both sides to begin with because I wanted to. Sorry, we paused. Through the magic of the pause button, we're back. The first step is to make sure that on the left-hand side, you have just the x squared plus or minus something x. And on the other side of the equation, you have a number. So this minus 31 was in the wrong place at the right time. But we're going to move it by adding 31 to both sides, and we end up with x squared minus 2x equals 31. Step 2, complete the square. Step 2 is completing the square, taking half of that 2 and squaring it. That is 1. Therefore, we're going to add 1 to both sides of the equation. The reason we do it is because we are completing the square. And if I add something on the left-hand side, I've got to add the same thing on the right-hand side. All right, if you're watching this at home, I know we just jumped down a little bit, but I wanted to give us some room. Step 3 is to factor the left-hand side. Because this is a perfect squared trinomial, factoring it turns into the same kind of pattern every time, where it's going to be x minus half of this number. Half of that number, and half of 2 is 1. So it's going to be x minus 1 squared equals 32. Next step is to take the square root of each side of the equation. So we have x minus 1 equals the square root of 32. And now we've got one simple step left. That is to add 1 to both sides of the equation. Adding that 1 cancels that out, and I'm left with x. On the right-hand side, I can't go up underneath this radical to add 1 there. That's why it stays outside, and I should have a plus or minus there in front of that square root. And 1 plus or minus the square root of 32. This is when you stop because you're able to give decimal answers, and you put 1 plus the square root of 32 in your calculator, and you'll round it to the nearest hundredth, and then you put 1 minus the square root of 32 in the calculator and round it to the nearest hundredth. We'll pause the video. When you come back in, those answers will be there. And there are your answers, 6.66 and negative 4.66. Next, solve by completing the square. We already have an equation that is in the right format. for a lack of a better word, we already have j squared minus 28j on the left-hand side, and we already have 41 on the right-hand side. Now, when I do these kinds of problems, you may notice that I leave some space. It's because I know I'm going to add something there. It reminds me that I'm using completing the square, and I'm going to add something to both sides, and so I'm going to leave that space there just so I can put what I'm going to add. Now, what I'm going to add to both sides is negative 28 over 2 and square it. When you have 14 squared or negative 14 squared, you should be adding 196 to both sides of this equation, because that's what 14 squared is. Yes, I've got it right. Check me in the class. Let me know if I'm wrong. At this point, because I've added the 196, and because half of that 28, half of that negative 28 is negative 14. All of that tells me that the next line that I'm going to write down is j minus 14, all of that squared, because that equals the same thing that's up above it, equals 237. Next, we take the square root of both sides, and we have j minus 14 equals plus or minus the square root of 237. Our last step, to add 14 to both sides of the equation. And our solutions are 14 plus the square root of 237 and 14 minus the square root of 237. So our two solutions, rounded to the nearest hundredth, are 29.39 and negative 1.39. Now, some of your math teachers may be so crazy particular about the way that you give answers that if you put parentheses around that, they would count it wrong. Because if you put parentheses around that, it looks like an ordered pair. So when you're given solutions, do not, on paper, don't put parentheses around your solutions. It's a list. It's a list of numbers. All right, here's an example that we're not going to do. It's just there for you to look at, I guess. This is an example that we're not going to do in fourth block, but we did it in first block. And it was how to do one if you have an odd number. If you have an odd number, notice that you're going to have some decimals. You're either going to have some decimals or some fractions. And because we don't have to be exact on this, we don't have to use fractions. We can use these decimals, and we'll still get some answers at the end. So if you're looking at this now, just pause it, try to cover this up, and work that out yourself. But let's make another problem. Give me an odd number.
7.
And give me some negative number.
Negative 25.
And that's going to be over here because that's how I have to start out looking. Now, what I do now is still the same process. It's just going to feel different because of the odd number. So you take the 7, divide it by 2, you get 3.5, and now square that. Squaring that gives you 12.25, so you're going to add 12.25 to both sides of this equation. Even though it's not pretty, but everything that's not pretty still works out. We're going to work it out the same way. The next step, because we completed the square on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, is to factor that and make it x plus 3.5 squared. Maybe you're asking where that 3.5 came from. You should be thinking that's 7 divided by 2. You always use this value of b to find that number. So now it's factored. You go to the other side. Negative 25 plus 12.25 is 12.75. Negative. Thank you. So it's negative. And by the way, make sure that your negatives really look like negatives and that they don't get lost in the problem. Now we have to take the square root of both sides. So we have x plus 3.5 equals negative 12.75, or the square root of, plus or minus the square root of. Our last step before hitting the calculator is to subtract 3.5 from each side. And we have x equals negative 3.5 plus or minus the square root of negative 12.75. Before you get into your calculator, you should recognize that you have a negative number under the square root sign. So your calculator is going to need to be in imaginary mode. Mode in the calculator is a button that's up by the second, and there's this button that says mode, and you're going to go in there and you're going to look for this. Look for the A plus BI so that it will give you some instructions. Or it'll put the calculator in the right mode. So once you do that, mode, arrow down to where you see real, and then arrow over to the A plus BI and select that choice. So that when you put negative 3.5 plus the square root of negative 12.75, you do that so that you don't get, it's really ugly, isn't it?
Yeah.
The reason is because there's a negative under there. And I can tell you that with this particular skill, right now, we don't want to use a negative. So I'm going to go back all the way up here. If you're copying this down, hopefully you use pencil, because we're going to change that negative 25 to a positive. We're going to change the negative 25 to a positive so that we don't have a negative number under the radical sign. Because none of these problems, as far as this video and this skill, require you to have a negative number under the radical sign. That's another lesson for another day. Instead of that negative 12.75, we're going to have 37.25. That's the only thing that's going to change. And under the radical sign, instead of that negative 12 point something, we're going to have 37.25. Don't let that blow your mind. It's just changing a number. That's all we did, is change the negative 25 to a 25. And 25 plus 12.25 is 37.25, and that follows down. Since we made those changes, we don't have to do this. You shouldn't have to do this with this skill at all at this level. Later on, like I said, we will. But our two answers, rounded to the nearest hundredth, are 2.60 and negative 9.60. That's our examples of completing or solving by completing the square. And that's all I have to say about that.